Okay, I think we're live. No microphone today, so hopefully the audio quality is workable. Wouldn't it be great if I could reach some kind of landing with Heidegger? I think I'd like to do that. And today I'm going to think out loud about the structure of how I might do that, and then focus in particular on one quality that I have some new thoughts about, which is thrownness. So let's remind ourselves what the project is here. The project is Heidegger seems to have had some pretty powerful insights around what it means to be us. People. And these ideas seem to not to have really stuck in some important sense. Is that true? Like, in some ways, like kind of the fact that we're just cultural beings, we're social, a lot of our things that we find important are constructed. That's mainstream now. Space-time might not be real, sort of, in some important ways. That's sort of half mainstream. I think it's like the way it hasn't stuck is like the everyday way in which we carry ourselves is not informed by the insights that Heidegger seems to have had, and that I think one can have simply just by engaging seriously with the things he's talking about. Because like one of the miracles of Heidegger, unlike any other philosopher I've read, is like he's pointing to experiences, phenomena, insights that are achievable by us in the moment, and don't need to move through a fully, like a thorough understanding of Heidegger. Whereas like Kant or Hegel or any other number of philosophers, propose systems that you need to sort of download the system and then run the system on your like local machine, as it were, and then like it feels more scientific. Like, yep, I'm getting the same result when I run the system, but the feeling of Heidegger is very much go see for yourself. And I mean, I'm experiencing Heidegger as interpreted through Dreyfus, and Dreyfus is also a sort of a see for yourself person, and so I want to recognize that like lineage, and that that the Heidegger I'm interested in is the same Heidegger that Dreyfus is interested in, although my own engaging with the phenomena leads to some different places than it does for Dreyfus. So the project here is like, there's some ideas here, there's some approaches here, there's some questions here that are worth asking, and still aren't being asked in sort of this everyday sense. And this is sort of the same playground as meditation and inquiry. But meditation as a technology is like way more successful and widespread. So I think at this point it's common practice to sort of sit down and breathe and get in the body, and then some insights with meditation are available right away, right? Like I think one of the most deceivingly profound insights is like, when I do less, I feel better. With seemingly very little downside. So what does that have to say? It seems to point to two things. One is that like our natural state is pleasant-ish. And this is sort of at first blush insights, right? Because somehow it's the case that I don't have to do anything to feel good. It feels good not to do anything. And not in like a slouchy, lazy way, but just like a solid oak tree way. In a vast ocean way, in a tall mountain way. And then the sister insight there is that whatever it is that all of that, whatever it is that I'm doing that's causing pressure in my head and pain, tightness, contraction, doesn't seem like I actually have to do that to see clearly, have powerful thoughts, relate to people. Like, I'm using computer metaphors today. I've been on the machine a lot, so forgive me, but like, it's like when you, what was it called? Activity monitor? When your fan would be running. And these problems are like, I think, largely resolved, but 5 years ago, your computer is running hot and the fan is blowing, you open up activity monitor and it's like, this weird random app is taking 80% of my CPU, and you close it. And like, you have sort of these runaway processes that they think that they're doing a very important job, but they're not. So, that's, you just sit down and you experience that. And then if you sit down for years, you maybe have deeper insights. So I think Heidegger's main stuff belongs sort of in this family, but he's pointing his arrow somewhere different, because I think like Buddhism, or at least the Buddhism that I know, like I think is pointing its arrow mostly at like our primordial condition, like our what I wanted to say was like the way things really are, but Buddhism does this thing where it's like, no, we're not talking about the way things really are. All we're talking about is experience. But of course, when you get further into it, there doesn't seem to be anything outside of our experience to talk about. So it's very muddy. But I guess Buddhism is going for like the home run. Buddhism is going for like the peace and the understanding from which all other understanding arises naturally, right? So it's like the cheat code. It's like cutting the root of confusion. And Heidegger is not really trying to cut the root of confusion or ignorance. He's trying to like point to that thing and those things that we do in a somewhat different way. In a way, he's like more Buddhist than Buddhism, in the sense that, and I mean that's a silly thing to say, of course, but like when you get into all these non-dual, dual things, it's just like okay, so the dual stance might be something like this life is trash or an illusion. The only real peace is sort of cessation and the end of suffering and non-existence. So let's strive for that. May we never be reborn. And then, the V2 of that is like, like, for sure, total merging with the primordial awakeness that we already are is great. And also, we are never not that. So even when we're here suffering and plodding through life, we still are that awareness, that awakeness. And so, like, there's really not a problem here. And then you could even go further and say that, these there's not even a separation between the big I and the small I, or the awake and the asleep self, and on and on and on. You can continue to sort of make a move that is resolving any kind of separation. I think Heidegger is like directly interested in that process of separating and unifying, and the machinery by which, whether you want to call it the small I or the big I, like there's some engine, and he's very interested in how that engine operates in its most everyday way, not like the hopelessly lost people or the wonderfully awake people, but like all people. What does it mean to be a person? Whether you're, lost in your bullshit, or whether you're, as he would say, fully authentic, awake to both sort of how things really are and awake to your own humanness. So the project is like formalizing that, and maybe just bringing it into sort of meditative inquiry. Maybe that's one way of thinking about the project. And the good news is I don't think we really need to learn much about Heidegger. Like, I think there's ways to pull out the most relevant bits. But he is wonderful with his language. And so I want to here's what I'm thinking. Let's just lay it out here. Sort of the pith of this teaching is that Dasein has these three aspects, or three flavors of the same structure. It's called the care structure. The care structure has these three flavors, or our condition has three qualities. We are always already thrown into the world. We're always already projecting onto possibilities. And we're always already like falling. So for any situation, anytime we find ourselves thrown, projecting and falling, or fall in. And by examining and exploring and feeling into those conditions, we start to see how time emerges from these qualities of our condition. So time, rather than being fundamental or before or without us, it is actually not the case. Time emerges from these primordial qualities. And, neatly, in the sense that the past emerges from our thrownness, the future emerges from our projecting onto possibilities, and the present emerges from our falling. And I think, if we really hang out in that exploration for like a while, like a month, and maybe meditate on it a little bit or feel into it a little bit, I do think that opens up some interesting stuff. Specifically, it maybe becomes possible to see the constructed nature of time and see how it's constructed from and out of these aspects of the care structure. And the care structure, I think, will probably become clear at some point, but to some extent, it's not that important. The care structure is not other than thrownness, fallenness, and projection. Once you start to see the world this way, also, I think a lot of mystical interpretations of things like the fall of Adam become apparent. And it's sort of like an interpretive mode that opens up, that reinforces the teaching in a lot of unexpected places. So I think it's very powerful. I think it's well worth formalizing. I think it's roughly as powerful as a practice as watching the breath. That's what I think. So thrownness, I've been having trouble with, and I had a dream last night that kind of answered, I think, maybe one way to talk about what thrownness is. But maybe I've got this Plato, the Stanford kind of encyclopedia up. And I've skimmed this in the past and I found it to be really good. So I'm going to see just quickly before we talk about how I experience thrownness, what this has to say. And I like this too because it's an alternative to Dreyfus, although I'll need to weave in Dreyfus at some point. Let's just read this. As Dasein, that's as a person, but as a person in this particular way, not a biological being exactly, or a rational being, but as whatever it is we are Dasein. Definition TBD. As Dasein, I ineluctably find myself in a world that matters to me in some way or another. This is what Heidegger calls thrownness, Geworfenheit, a having been thrown into the world. And it's related to disposedness, Befindlichkeit. And I don't completely grasp for Heidegger disposedness versus thrownness. I guess because of my thrown condition, I develop disposedness. I'm disposed to make use of, or, well, actually I'm not quite sure. I'm not going to go there. I'm just going to ignore disposedness. I just want to talk about thrownness. And moods, I think, are a good example of being thrown. I'm always in some mood. I'm never neutral. I'm always like thrown into, but also potentially thrown out of something. One of the practices that I like to do here is to Google image the German. And this was, I think, very helpful for Geworfenheit. Maybe it's, I need to remove the noun, just geworfen, yeah. So this is, a cement brick which has been thrown and it's broken. This is a ship sort of tossed in the seas. This is a child being thrown by his parent, throwing a message in a bottle into the ocean. A mask thrown away, sort of discarded. There's one image here, I like this one a lot. This is like flotsam and jetsam, sort of stuff thrown up onto the beach, thrown out, tossed. I mean, you can see a few of these different images involve water and the ocean, and for me, that's a very powerful grounding image of the beach and the ocean and waves, and we'll talk more about that as we get into thrownness. But just trying to establish the mood or the tone of geworfen. So one of the ways I was thinking about thrownness before the dream I had last night, but I think it's still helpful, is that like Tom Hanks in Castaway, right? He's shipwrecked. He's thrown onto the beach, and the debris of the FedEx plane that he'd been on is thrown up with him, and he's now he finds himself in a situation, and this situation is informed by sort of the other shit that's been thrown up by him. And so, or not by him, thrown up with him, right? So he and the FedEx plane are thrown onto the beach, and now you're in sort of like a survival place. And I think thrownness is fundamentally unpleasant. Like, it's the difference between like waking up from a dream and waking up, neither of these are thrownness, right? Neither waking up and saying, and like kind of, I wake up and I feel tingly sensations and maybe the light of the sun and decide stretching. I think I'll get out of bed now. That's not thrownness. Another version of waking up that thrownness wouldn't be sort of just like starting from scratch, right? I wake up as a being. Okay, what is my name? My name is Nick. Sort of instantiating from scratch, right? The way you might in computer programming, right? Like, make me a Nick, make me an object, and sort of like, okay, fetching these things. That's not thrownness. Thrownness is the way that most of us wake up every day, which is like, the alarm is blaring, fuck, what time is it? It's late. Where's the phone? right? Like you're thrown into a situation with the alarm bell running. Your head hurts. You're thirsty, and you're just like thrust and thrown and ejected into something. So oftentimes when we first have the thought of I'm Nick, it's oftentimes thrown. Another way I think about being thrown is like a rider on a horse being thrown from his horse and like hitting his head and maybe coming to, right? Like, where am I, right? And like immediately having to make sense of his situation, having been thrown from his horse, but maybe doesn't remember being thrown from his horse. Another thing that I find like relevant for thrownness is those corpus callosum studies, right? Where like split brain patients, and you show them, something in one eye that goes to one lobe and another thing and it goes to another lobe, but there's no communication between the lobes, and so what'll happen is like you show the patient something like leave the room in the sort of motion action oriented part of their brain, so they start leaving the room, and then you ask the person like, well, where are you heading? But the part of their brain that they actually don't know where they're going, they say yeah, I'm just gonna go get a Coke and I'll be right back. Like they're thrown in, they don't know what the fuck they're doing, but then they're so fast at explaining things. It's another quality of thrownness. I experience thrownness hundreds of times a day. I go and, the computer, the internet is an incredible environment for thrownness. Just kind of zoning out, and I'm going to do this, and I need to check that thing, so I open up Twitter, and all of a sudden I'm like reading a AI paper, and it's like, just sort of like, I'm saying, what am I doing? We're like, okay, what am I doing? Yeah, I'm reading this paper because I'm interested in it, but it's like, no, I just sort of got lost I lost myself, and then when I found myself, I was thrown into a situation and I was coping with the shit that was around me. Last night I didn't sleep that well, and I kept waking up from dreams, and the content of the dreams or the message of the dream was like, you haven't gotten any sleep. And so by the time it was like 4 a.m., I had the feeling that I hadn't slept at all. I was thrown into a situation, and the name of the situation was I haven't slept at all. But it actually wasn't true. I was just dreaming that I hadn't been sleeping. This is very common. I think a lot of people experience that. Did I not sleep, or did I just dream that I wasn't sleeping? And I think hypnosis is similar to that, right? There's a way to whisper a message to someone's unconscious, and then they find themselves in that situation. Just the other day on Instagram, I was watching some video of a hypnotist who, he whispers to his friend, he hypnotizes his friend. When you wake up, all your friends are aliens. He wakes up, he's like, oh, right? And they're like, hey, what's wrong, man? He's like, nothing, right? He's thrown into this, like all of a sudden, just what the fuck? But we're always doing that. But rather than responding authentically, or I shouldn't say authentically because I don't necessarily want to tie it to Heidegger's authenticity at the moment, but rather than responding honestly of what the hell is going on here? How did I get here? What's the Talking Heads quote? How did I something about a house and a wife? That's not how most of us respond. Most of us will just respond like, oh yeah, I'm married and I've got kids and I'm doing the thing. So thrownness, we're already touching on the other two qualities, and that's fine because they are ultimately, according to Heidegger, equally primordial and in fact just one thing, but they sort of have these different qualities that are worth discussing in isolation. But thrownness is that finding oneself somewhere. Now, how does thrownness relate to the past? And is it premature to talk about that? I don't know if I know yet. So I mean, one way it maybe maps to the past is nostalgia. Like, because being thrown is so unpleasant and sort of has this headachy quality to it, whether you're waking up from a dream or you've been thrown from a horse or you're like lost on Twitter and you're like, huh? There's some sort of like groggy quality to thrownness. But we don't own it. We just sort of deal with whatever situation is and sort of I guess what I'm kind of wondering is, does that mean that the past, we then start to interpret some past as time when thing was better? I'm not sure. I need a hint here. Let's see if anyone can unlock the connection between thrownness and the past. Okay, I think this is helpful. So I think I was going down a slightly wrong direction when I was thinking about like the general past, like nostalgia or history. Although one of the powers, but also sort of the like perils of Heidegger and of all this thinking is it does sort of have this fractal nature, and you can think about it in terms of lifetimes, in terms of histories of societies, in terms of moments psychologically experienced, in terms of like structural moments, in terms of almost like a game clock, or like the way that the world is getting instantiated moment to moment. So it's really sort of like applicable in a lot of different directions. But when in doubt, I like to think about it as a formal or as a structural idea. And so if we find ourselves getting too psychological, we're probably a little bit off. And if we find ourselves getting too biological, we're probably a little bit off. And if we find ourselves getting too historical or social, that's a little bit off. It's more of like a formal, structural, syntaxy kind of thing. I think that's what Heidegger wants, not just my own personal preference, but it is also my personal preference. And so the key idea here, but I think we'll have to talk about temporality after we've introduced thrownness, projection, and falling, but the teaser, I guess, is that past, present, and future are always being constructed together, moment to moment. I think this passage says it well. Each event of intelligibility that makes up a moment in Dasein's existence must be unpacked using all three temporal ecstasies. I don't know, I'm not familiar with that use of ecstasy. I guess it means openings? I'm not sure. Each such event is constituted by thrownness, projection, and falling/discourse. In a sense, then, each such event transcends itself as a momentary episode of being by, in the relevant sense, co-realizing a past and future along with the present. This explains why the future is not later than having been, and having been is not earlier than the present. In that sense, then, Dasein is always a combination of the futural, the historical, and the present. Let's just finish the thought. And since futurality, historicality, and presence, understood in terms of projection, thrownness, and fallenness/discourse, form the structural dimensions of each event of intelligibility, it is Dasein's essential temporality, or temporalizing, that provides the a priori transcendental condition for there to be care, the sense-making that constitutes Dasein's own distinctive mode of being. That's really juicy. I mean, that's like the ChatGPT passage to take out. So we'll probably come back to that again. I don't think we need to really know what it means yet, but the point being that, like, what is thrownness' relationship to the past? At every moment, let's talk about moments for a second. In any moment, I wake up, I'm here, and the world makes sense, right? I don't come into my situation fresh and clean and neutral and sort of say, like, okay, let's make sense of things here. Things are already making sense to me. They're already composed and constructed in some way. And that's because of a historicizing that's happening, a sort of a retrofitting. Maybe retrofitting is an interesting way to talk about thrownness. Like, I think I have this room for the next 3 minutes. Somebody came in. let's try it this way. The corpus callosum patient who's asked mid-stride, where are you going? And he says, to get a Coke. In that moment is co-constructing their future, past, and present. Again, this idea of they are constructing, there's a lot of like language here that's problematic that Heidegger would never endorse, but the exchange you get for that is like language you don't understand. But the Coke in that moment and the getting of the Coke are constructed in that moment as the past. That's the thrown quality. We're like thrown into a situation and are always already like creating histories for the situation that explain what we're doing. I think I'll have a better sense of this after I incorporate fallenness and projection, because sometimes I get confused about these three aspects because they do overlap. And so I might need to come back to thrownness after having introduced the other two. To see if we can't crystallize like the true flavor of each one. But I think, the enduring image for me is being washed up on the beach with flotsam and jetsam, with sort of garbage. That garbage, rather than being treated as garbage or random stuff, flotsam or jetsam, a history is constructed in real time about how these things came together that makes sense, and that historicizing is like a packaging of our thrown condition, something like